very much. Well, straight to the panel. Thank you very much, everybody. And any questions? That's all right. Yeah, here we go. Here, thanks.
My question is to Sam Chard, and you mentioned, Sam, about the Productivity Commission recommendations. One of them including that it's recommending the states and territories have more autonomy in their decision making regarding expenditure and relief and recovery and reconstruction. That would suggest to me that they don't have autonomy at the moment. Could you please talk a little bit about what the arrangements are currently that suggest that they don't have autonomy and what needs to change and where that should change?
The current arrangements, they're the natural disaster relief and recovery arrangements, and they're cost-sharing arrangements between the Commonwealth and the states and territories. And effectively what occurs is that states accumulate expenditure against eligible events. So natural disasters that cost a jurisdiction a percentage of that state's revenue. And the Commonwealth reimburses the state based on a list of eligibility. Wherever you have a list of eligibility, you effectively drive behaviour. The Commonwealth is in no position to be an authority on what good recovery looks like, on what good relief looks like. It's certainly, I don't think, in any position to dictate what kind of operational response state and territory emergency services undertake. But wherever you have a framework that's about reimbursement of eligible expenditure, you inadvertently drive a particular type of behaviour so that the expenses actually meet the eligibility criteria. The Productivity Commission's recommending reformed arrangements that would be based on an early assessment of damage and some benchmarking prices around public infrastructure reconstruction costs, and then the provision of funding potentially early on with latitude provided to the states to actually invest that funding wherever they see fit. So your eligibility comes to eligibility of potential cost and not actual cost, and that completely shifts the dynamic.
More questions? Please, while the questions are being asked, think about your next one, and we'll keep the questions pretty short if we can, keep the answers fairly short as well so we can get to as much as possible.
Hi, my question is to Sam and Andrew. How is the policy environment adapting to slow onset disasters, such as drought, perhaps the Hazelwood fire, mine fire disaster, and the Mr Fluffy disaster here in Canberra?
That's a really good question. Slow onset is, I think, a hugely important and interesting topic. I think you're alluding to heatwave. Is that correct?
Well, heatwave, drought.
Yeah. The recovery arrangements are really designed as a safety net. So when we're thinking about the policy environment in terms of recompense to the states and territories, we're talking about a financial safety net for things that are unexpected shocks. So the logic follows that slow onset events are easier to prepare for and to provision for. Now, that doesn't reduce the impact on communities, it doesn't reduce the impact on infrastructure, but it is a central tenet that goes to our actual policy arrangements around cost sharing, if you like, in terms of our policy thinking around operational response and recovery. I mean, I'm really speaking here on behalf of my state and territory counterparts, but I think there's a growing appreciation that there is an important connectivity between health response and emergency response that we don't have very well, we don't have great mechanisms around that are well established and tried and tested, and there's the potential to do a lot more work in that space.
Again, I'd echo Sam's observation. Really good question, Chris. And I think, firstly, I'm quite bemused by Mr. Fluffy as a concept for a name of an event that's unfolding, but that's for another day. The thing to me is that we've been doing some strategic planning work for the next 5 years, 15 to 20, and one of the things someone asked me the other day internally was, oh, that stuff you're talking about is really good, but what about terrorism? And what about drought? And what about 6 other things? And to me, the support mechanisms or whatever we're doing needs to be robust enough to support people with the need they have. I think it's where, you know, an organisation, perhaps not in government, has the ability to work across a range of things. Sometimes we get ourselves caught up in, you know, this is a disaster thing, this is a health thing, this is a something else thing. It's probably good public policy that we work across whatever the problem is and support the community in dealing with it. Whether or not you term it disaster management or not, who knows? I know from our organisation's point of view, in dealing with drought, it might not be the disaster people who lead the work, it might be the community service type people who are in communities working, but certainly some of the messages, the lessons, the tools that we use in a long-term recovery process after a fire or a flood will come to the fore and still be used, and I'd suggest good governments do that too.
Right, terrific. Thank you, Andrew.
I want to put an addition to the question asked by Chris behind me. One of the things that's interesting is a book by Rob Nixon called Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor, and he argues that the nature of environmentalism has to be different, where the disaster is slow. And I wonder if we need a new definition of emergency, because it's very hard to maintain crisis management over long periods. That's for anybody, perhaps particularly Helen, who talks about vulnerabilities, and Rob Nixon's work focuses on the most vulnerable groups.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I've done a fair bit of research on famines, both those in the last few years and earlier famines. And the difference between slow onset and rapid onset is really interesting, I think. One of the key issues is, when does a famine start and what are the obvious signs? And it does change with countries and cultures, but what seems to be common is the first sign is rising prices in the local marketplace, giving the sense that food supply is not keeping up with demand. The second is when you see local people selling off their assets, and in the developing world, this will be their bullocks or goats, etc. And the third will be when you see the males leaving the local community to go elsewhere to look for casual employment to add to the family income, to try to diversify sources of income with which they might purchase food. So a drought itself is not necessarily productive of a famine. And Sen, I think, has all the words on this, where his many books say that where there is good governance, right, drought doesn't produce a famine. Where there is very poor governance, including in colonial Bengal during World War II, for all sorts of reasons, there were policy failures. The China famine of 58 to 61 was really a policy failure. It was probably the worst famine in world history. It didn't have to occur, but the policy failures impacted with failure of rains, etc. With my students, I always say Australia had a 10-year drought, but we didn't have a famine. So a drought might be sudden, or it might be rapid onset or slow onset. It might be something that accumulates. A famine, similarly, can start slowly and then escalate quickly. And it has different effects in different countries, but I think the common element is the governance element and how authorities manage the lack of food in certain areas, whether there is surplus in other areas, and whether there are good transportation and communications networks that can move surplus food from one area to another where it might be needed.
Thanks, Helen. Stephen, can you add to that?
Yeah, a couple of comments on drought and heat. In 1989, the policy changed in Australia and drought was no longer a natural disaster. Now, we've wavered somewhat occasionally on that, mostly around election time in a drought, which is actually really understandable. You know, you try irrational decisions, people say, about politicians and disasters. It's also a very human reaction. So, but we've shifted to a risk management, a resilience approach. You know, we do exceptional circumstances again, but to nowhere near the extent we did. So we've actually defined that differently. And innovations like actually making relief payments and support available to small business as well as directly to farmers is actually about rural communities, not just the farm operators. I'd actually say in Australia, heat is the sleeper for me. The mortality and health impacts are already much larger than most other disasters we have, but they don't tend to get the media or coverage or the awareness. But the potential impacts on infrastructure and on transport systems as well, if we were really to be shattered by something in Australia, it would be a combination of heat, infrastructure and transport and utility hit, and I'll pick Melbourne and Sydney.
I think that's a really valid point Stephen makes, but I would also, suggest that there's a lot of work being done by governments around the country, state governments, around that very issue of heat. So, without going into individual examples, it is on the agenda.
Well, hello, my name is Julie Smith and I work mainly in the area of infant feeding, breastfeeding in particular. My question, I suppose, mainly to Helen, but also to Andrew and Stephen. I was approached recently by someone who works with UNICEF, and what he was looking for, and particularly with the response from Australia, was UNICEF is trying to get together a better package of assistance, first line assistance for mothers and babies, and he was looking to try and develop that capacity in this region. I just wonder if from your, and I know from my own experiences within the Breastfeeding Association with this floods in Brisbane and the fire in the ACT, that those sort of counselling resources, volunteer counselling resources are very much needed, and especially at the time the volunteers themselves are affected. I just wonder if from your experience, at a much wider level obviously, whether you've got any ideas about how Australia could contribute to such an initiative and where we'd start developing that sort of, helping UNICEF develop that sort of capacity.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'm most familiar with the situation after the Burmese Cyclone Nargis. Now, World Vision and a number of other INGOs are working with a number of domestic NGOs down that delta in the post-disaster reconstruction phase. UNICEF I've spoken with, but to my knowledge they're not really directly involved. It's more these other grassroots type NGOs who are directly involved. There seems to me to be an interlinked cooperation developing between some aspects of government, such as the Department of Medical Research in the Ministry of Health, the domestic and the INGOs down the Delta, and the community village associations. I have a colleague who's doing a lot of work on community access from the perspective of trying to improve outcomes for maternal and child health in that immediate relief, recovery, reconstruction phase. She goes all the way down to Middle Island and conducts surveys. It's a gruelling task. It's very much part of the development phase. We know that in the immediate relief phase, in evacuation shelters, etc., UNICEF and others, the whole range of INGOs working up there, including Merlin and so on, they provide gender-specific health needs. They do provide services for maternal and child health care. They work closely with the government at all levels because they have to. This is a situation which also plays out in Taiwan. If UNICEF wishes to get involved in that phase, it would probably fund the local domestic NGOs to be able to increase their capacity to provide these services at village level, because it's very much a grassroots activity. It's painstaking, it's difficult to access because there's no infrastructure down there except by flat bottom boats with outboard motors. UNICEF in Myanmar does work closely with the Ministry of Health, and that's probably the best way to go in these developing countries, probably the best in the Philippines as well, because you've got to get access right to the coalface to be able to provide the services that you're talking about. In terms of healthcare resources, these are often stretched. Volunteers themselves need counselling after they've been in the field for a little while. They need specialist training. UNICEF could usefully get involved in that type of service as well. I probably should stop there.
Helen, thank you so much. The whole discussion has brought up so many issues. We've come nearly to the end, but please don't rush away. There's time for discussion, drinks, mingling afterwards. I might just call on Stephen just for a closing thought. Stephen, so many issues brought up. Is there anything you think over the next 3 to 12 months policymakers, agencies, organisations should be thinking about?
A crucial one has already been mentioned, which is the first report from the Productivity Commission, which will, PC reports have very long shelf life at times. They'll set the agenda for a long time. And to see really diverse and wide input into that, not just the usual suspects like us, but to see that actually really out there discussed in the community. Because I think from an Australian perspective, who should be doing what across the community and the NGO sector and 3 levels of government is something that we still have a fair bit of confusion about, or at least we all have different opinions on. I think the other one, which Helen didn't mention, so I'll give it a plug, there is an emerging disaster research network in the region, and I think Australian engagement in that, we have really good research links with US, so with the CRC, we have some very good European links. I think our links with our own region in terms of understanding capacities and vulnerabilities is not what it should be.
Thank you so much. That is the end of the evening. On behalf of Richard Thornton and the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, thank you very much for taking the time out this evening. Please thank Andrew Collins, Dr. Helen Jones and Professor Stephen Davis. And please join us for a drink afterwards. Thank you very much.